So today we come to Amos chapter 4. As we said last week, Amos is the earliest of the minor prophets. Most scholars place Amos' writing right around the year 760 BCE. The prophet Malachi, whom we studied or looked at 2 weeks before, lived about in the 5th century BCE. So there's about a 200-year gap between the first minor prophet, Amos, and the last minor prophet, Malachi. And so because Amos preaches before exile, what we find is that Israel during this time is at a place of relative peace and security. Amos said in chapter 6, verse 1, "Woe to you who are complacent in Zion, and to you who feel secure on Mount Samaria, O you who put far away the day of disaster and bring near the seat of violence." Israel is in a time of relative peace and calm and security and actually complacency. And this is what Amos is speaking into. Israel was economically prosperous, as seen in the fact that people built houses of hewn stone as opposed to just houses of field stone that you would find in any field. And the fact that many had summer and winter homes. So again, a picture here of a fairly well-to-do place. The people believed also that the evidence that God was happy with them spiritually was that God was blessing them economically. And so we said last week, it's as if the Israelites are floating down a river, margarita in hand, sunglasses on, SPF 30, listening to Zach Brown knee-deep in the water somewhere. And along comes Amos in a canoe with a wetsuit and goggles and says, "Hey guys, 100 yards up ahead there's a major waterfall." And everybody starts laughing. Right. Amos, look, God's clearly blessed us, and he wouldn't bless us if he wasn't happy with us. And so Amos comes along and says, yeah, but your economic condition is a very poor estimation of your spiritual condition. Our economic welfare is a very poor gauge of our spiritual welfare. And so Amos says that the true test of spiritual welfare for the people of God is not economic status, but how well they treat their neighbors. And so Amos is called the social justice prophet. And Amos is the one that Martin Luther King Jr. quoted in his famous I Have a Dream speech. So I want us to see three things from Amos chapter 4 today. I want to see the deafening effects of noise in the lives of God's people, the quieting effects of pain in the lives of God's people, and then lastly, we'll look at the awaiting joy of hire in the lives of God's people. The deafening effects of noise, the quieting effects of pain, and the awaiting joy of hire. So let's look at those three things. Country music has become less and less enjoyable to me over the years. For some of you, perhaps it was never enjoyable. But, I still like some country music, but I've pushed a lot of it away for the simple reason that so many of the songs are sung by men in their 40s, and they're still obsessed with high school sweethearts. And I say to myself, can we sing about something more adult by now? But Kenny Chesney has one song in particular that I like called Noise. It's a fairly recent song, so here's the lyrics. 24-hour television gets so loud that no one listens. Sex and money and politicians talk. But there ain't really no conversation, ain't nothing left to the imagination. Trapped in our phones and we can't make it stop this noise. And the chorus says, yeah, we scream, yeah, we shout till we don't have a voice. In the streets and the crowds, it ain't nothing but noise. Drowning out all the dreams of this Tennessee boy, just trying to be heard in all this noise. We can't sleep, we can't think, can't escape the noise. We can't shake the noise, so we just make noise. So there is a commentary on our day and time. And so the picture that Kenny Chesney paints in this song is of every channel of the TV being listened to at the same time resulting in just noise. The picture is of everyone getting their say and no one being heard. In other words, no genuine conversation is happening, but that's not because conversation is not happening. It's because no one is being heard. And what we are all trying to do, says Kenny, is we're all just trying to be heard in all this noise. Yeah, we scream, yeah, we shout till we don't have a voice. In the streets and the crowds, it ain't nothing but noise. Drowning out all the dreams of this Tennessee boy, just trying to be heard in all this noise. And being heard is different than speaking. Would you agree? Yes. The irony of our times is that we have 1,000 more ways to be heard today than we did 30 years ago. But it's probably true that in many ways we all feel less heard today than we did 30 years ago. And the result of this, if you've spoken and not been heard, the result of that is frustration. When you don't feel heard by someone, it's incredibly frustrating, and you can either clam up and say, "Oh, forget it. We're going to talk again. Nobody cares anyway," and you get the silent treatment, right? And the silent treatment is really just a way to jab someone, right? Fine, you don't want to listen to me. I'll never speak to you again. You'll never know why, right? You ever said that? So the silent treatment is a form of revenge. But the other thing you can do, if you don't give the silent treatment, when you don't feel heard, is you can talk more and more and more and get louder and louder and louder until you're screaming. And then the people that are listening to you are covering their ears saying, "Why are you screaming?" And you don't get heard then either. So either way, the result of not being heard is frustration. Another way to say what Kenny has said is that there is so much communication today, but so little communing, so little connecting. It's this mile-wide, inch-deep syndrome. We have Facebook friends a mile wide, each of them about an inch deep. Right? And so I think that what we see in the political expression of this today is both sides of the aisle getting louder and louder and louder, in part because neither side feels like the other side hears or understands or even wants to. Not being heard is incredibly frustrating. And so what we see in the book of Amos is a God who is speaking, but who is not being heard by his people. And rather than give the silent treatment and let Israel play the guessing game as to why God's upset, God comes to Israel through the prophets time and time again and says, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Hear me. Listen." And as we watch Amos write, last week we talked about Amos's the creativity that God has given Amos and how he used that God-given gift to bring a unique prophetic message. But as we watch Amos write, it's as if each new section of his prophecy becomes more persistent and more creative in his approach because they're not hearing him. And in chapter 4, Amos kind of gets personal. So in chapters 1 and 2, he kind of beats around the bush, right? He talks about 7 different nations, but he's not really wanting to talk about them at all. He's beating around the bush until he gets to chapter 2, verse 6. What he's really getting to talk about is, for 3 sins and for 4, I will not turn back Israel's punishment. Okay? So in chapters 1 and 2, he kind of beats around the bush. Chapter 4, he kind of goes for the jugular. He gets real personal. His tone changes, and he gets a little sarcastic. So listen to Amos again. Hear this word, this is verse 1. "You cows of Bashan and on Mount Samaria, you women who oppress the poor and crush the needy, and say to your husbands, bring us some drinks. The sovereign Lord has sworn by his holiness, the time will surely come when you will be taken away with hooks, the last of you with fish hooks. You will each go straight out through breaches in the wall, and you will be cast out toward Harmon, declares the Lord." So cows of Bashan. So Bashan was a region east of the Jordan River in northern Palestine where the land was very fertile. It was always a lush valley of vegetation where animals could feed to the full and get fat. So it's as if Amos stands up tall and shouts, "Hey, all you fat cows, you women of Bashan." I don't know about you. Last time I called a woman a fat cow, it did not go well with me. I called something about an emergency bill. I've never actually called a woman that. But how long do you do this before you get yourself killed? So why call them this? Were the women of the land literally fat? Well, maybe. But at a minimum, what we are seeing here is Amos pulling out all the stops in terms of being heard. You don't call the women of the land fat cows without evoking some attention. So God is persistent toward his people. He is not going to let them ignore him. He's going to be heard, even if it costs him the life of a prophet. Okay? And so one of the things that can quickly block our ears, that Amos accuses them of, one of the things that can quickly block our ears from hearing God is wealth and luxury. Now, if you've ever had nothing, that's the time you want God to speak. Right? In fact, when you have nothing, your ears are wide open, and it's like you're standing in the classroom saying, hands up in the air, shouting, "Lord, teach me, I'm all ears." But when we are wealthy and comfortable, the temptation is to fill our lives with noise and thereby drown out God's voice. Right? And so sometimes that it's intentional, sometimes it's not intentional, but nevertheless it's common. And so listen to what Amos says in chapter 6, verse 4. "Woe to those who lie on beds of ivory and stretch themselves out on their couches, and eat lambs from the flock and calves from the midst of the stall, who sing idle songs to the sound of the harp, and like David invent for themselves instruments of music, who drink wine in bowls, and anoint themselves with the finest oils, but are not grieved over the ruin of Joseph." So Amos says, you people are fat and luxurious, and you no longer hear God's voice, because if you did hear God's voice, you would be grieved over what God is grieved over, and you are not. You are wealthy, you are well, but you are blind to the pain of your brothers. So Amos he's not finding something wrong with wealth and luxury in and of itself, as if a vow of poverty is the only, way of living God condones. But Amos is saying you have allowed your wealth to deafen you to God's voice, and God wants your attention at all times. Amos says, don't you dare ignore him now that you are wealthy, because he will make you unwealthy real quick. So we see the deafening effects of noise in the lives of God's people. Wealth and luxury encourage us to invite noise into our lives, which drowns out God's voice. And when God is not being heard, he has a right to be frustrated. And so Amos turns up the decibel of his preaching so that they will hear him above the noise. Hey, fat cows, listen up. What do you say? Secondly, we see the quieting effects of pain in the lives of God's people. Let's read again verses 6 through 11. I gave you empty stomachs in every city, lack of bread in every town. You've not returned to me, declares the Lord. I also withheld rain from you when the harvest was still 3 months away. I sent rain on one town, but withheld it from another. One field had rain, another had none, and dried up. People staggered from town to town for water, but did not get enough to drink, and yet you've not returned to me, declares the Lord. So on and on Amos goes, saying, I did this, you didn't listen. I did this, you didn't listen. Then I did this, and you didn't listen. And this passage can rub us the wrong way in terms of how we think God should be. In fact, if you're a skeptic today, you might be angry at this passage because it says a couple things. First of all, it says, God brings bad things into the world. That's what it says. It says, God brings empty stomachs. It says, God brings lack of bread. God withholds rain. God sends pestilence. God sends plagues. God even caused bloodshed. And that is all very concerning to us. And it also says God does all of this to get worshipers. God does all of this so people will return to him. And so if you're reading this in your Bible for the first time, it probably doesn't sit well with you. God seems like a vindictive tyrant who wants worshipers bowing at his feet with their eyes closed and mouth shut, and he'll keep squeezing harder and harder until they shape up. And so if this is the way you feel when you read this, I want to tell you to hold your horses a little bit, because there's something more to see. As we've talked about before at Water's Edge, the God of the Bible is a God who is most concerned about the weak of society. Okay? Darwinism tells us the strong are most important. Religion tells us that the morally upright are most important. Capitalism tells us the successful are most important. Our education system tells us the smartest are most important. But the God of the Bible demands that the weakest of society, the most vulnerable, the ones who stand most defenseless against their stronger brothers and sisters, the babies, the children, the widows, the orphans, the elderly. The Bible demands that these people have first place in God's heart. In the eyes of God, of the God of the Bible, justice is not being actualized in the world unless these groups of people are being cared for well. And it's not as if God is not concerned with everyone else. It's that he is principally concerned with the weak. And here's why. If humanity places priority on those who cannot stick up for themselves, they will most certainly treat with value everyone else too. But when we prioritize, when we value most the people in first place, those in last place will eventually be forgotten. Jesus himself said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." The God of the Bible demands that the weakest, most vulnerable people in his world take first place, and the strong get to the back of the bus. Okay? And when the strong of any community are placing themselves first and the weak last, you better believe God is willing to come down and shake things up a bit until that equilibrium is reversed. So what we are seeing in verses 6 through 11 is God coming down to shake up their affluency so as to allow the innocent bubbles of little Timmy and sweet Gracie and great-grandma Sue and precious widow Miss Doris and orphan boy Bobby to fizzle to the top of society again. Amos says very clearly that God is bringing pain into the world, but let us not misunderstand why he is doing it. He is bringing pain upon Israel in order to realign society according to his will. And the fact that we are upset that God does this probably says that we are less concerned with the weak than God is. Amen. Folks, God will not stand around and let us revel in affluency when the most helpless among us are being choked. So let's apply that to our day and time. That means that God is very angry at the reality of child sex trafficking today, and may at some point be willing to come down and shake things up a bit. God is very angry when bosses in modern business assume the role of a slave master instead of the role of the greatest servant in the organization, and he may be willing at some point to come down and shake things up. This means God is angry when I go to work for money. Why? Because if I go to work to make money, I make the people I'm working with and the people my work benefits a secondary concern of mine. I'm just here to get in your pockets, and I don't really care if you have what you need. Okay? This means God is very angry when abortions happen, because there's no one more helpless than an unborn child. God is angry, folks, whenever the weak are devalued, and he's not going to stand around and just let it happen. Eventually, he will come down and shake things up a bit. And that, I believe, is what we are seeing in this chapter. Now here's where we must be very careful. Okay? We must be very careful not to interpret every hurricane or every economic slump or every painful event of our lives as God's displeasure with us. It is true that God comes down to shake things up, but it is not true that every time things are shaken up, God has come down. Does that make sense? Now, this is the lie of karma. Not that God has done it per se, but that because you did this bad thing over here is happening to you. This is the lie of reincarnation. Right? Reincarnation says you exist in the status you do in this life because in your last life you lived this way. Okay? This was the lie of ancient Judaism in the time of Jesus. Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that this man was born blind? Jesus said, neither. So it's true that God comes down to shake things up sometimes, but it is not true that every time things are shaken up, God has come down. Therefore, we must be careful because the reality is there is another force at work in the world who likes to shake things up a bit too. And therefore, you were not abused as a child because God was against you. You were abused as a child because Satan was against you in the form of your abuser. So we cannot interpret every painful event in our lives as God shaking things up in his displeasure. However, hear me here. However, here's what we must be ready to do whenever painful events occur for us. Just because something painful happens to me does not mean God is trying to shake me up, but I must be ready to allow every shake-up to quiet me, so that if God did want to say something to me in the shake-up, I could hear him. Every shake-up is not caused by God, but God can communicate to me in every shake-up if I will become quiet in the pain. This is what the shake-up of empty stomachs and lack of bread and drought and pestilence and plague was intended to do for the Israelites. It was intended to bring a long quiet to the people so that they could hear God's call to repent and change their ways. And we must be ready, regardless of what the shake-up is, to become quiet in pain so that if he wants to speak to us, we will hear him. So we see the deafening effects of noise in the lives of God's people. Wealth and luxury are not wrong in of themselves, but they do encourage us to invite noise into our lives and thereby drown out God's voice. Secondly, we see the quieting effects of pain in the lives of God's people. Although not every painful event is caused by God, God is willing to cause painful events in order to allow the weakest among us to fizzle to the top again. And then lastly, and we'll close with this, we see the awaiting joy of hire in the lives of God's people. Look at verse 12. Therefore, this is what I will do to you, Israel, and because I will do this to you, prepare to meet your God. So the people in Amos' time did not take their pain as an invitation to quiet, right? Instead, Amos says over and over again, you did not return to me, declares the Lord. You didn't quiet yourself. You didn't listen. No matter what I said or what I did, you would not return to me. And this is a very sad state of affairs, and it evidences to us that it is possible for the human heart to become so deaf that no matter what is said to them or what is done to them, they will not return to the Lord. It is possible to get to that place. And so Amos' prophecy is really quite bleak. Amos voices very little hope that these people can avoid the destruction of exile about to come to them. Therefore, preparing to meet their God was to be a very terrifying thing for them. And let me say that preparing to meet God for each of us would be a very terrifying thing too, if it were not for the fact that God first prepared to meet us.
Amen. Thank you.
To prepare to meet God is to prepare for the interview of your life. It is to make ourselves look good. It is to accumulate all the necessary good work experience. It is to spend this life in preparation for the interview of a lifetime. It is to prepare your best resume. It is to put on that resume all the attainments of the right schools and right clubs, and the accumulation of a plethora of community service hours so as to prove our value to the good boss. Preparing to meet God is the act of perfect presentation before the perfect boss. And when most people think of the final exit interview of their lives, they generally believe that although not perfect, their resume will pretty well hold up to the good boss's standards. Right? Most people generally believe that they will be prepared to meet God one day. But the gospel of Jesus Christ tells us that there has never been a resume that God read that he did not instantly trash and say, next, except one. The gospel of Jesus Christ says only one man was ever prepared to meet God. Only one man had a resume God was pleased with. Only one man had a life God found worthy of hire, and that man was Jesus Christ. And his exit interview was like no exit interview ever seen before. In Jesus' interview, God said, you're hired. And Jesus said, here's a copy of my resume for each of them too. I crossed out my name and wrote theirs in red. The gospel of Jesus tells us that Jesus was the perfect candidate of heaven who got fired so we could be hired. He got canned so we could be employed. He got rejected so we could be accepted. The gospel tells us that Jesus deserved no shakeup, but intentionally got shook up for us. It says he heard every word of God, yet was treated like a cow from Bashan, so that we could have green pastures forever. It says Jesus was drowned in the noise of our affluence, so that we could be welcomed by the quiet whisper of our Father. It says Jesus did no injustice, but took the blame for all of ours. It tells us that we are the affluent strong. We are the arrogant wealthy. We are the complacent complainers, and Jesus became the abused child so that we could become God's child. Jesus became the abandoned orphan so that we could become God's family. Jesus became the neglected elderly so that our wounds could be healed. The gospel tells us that to meet God would be to meet our death, but because Jesus met with God first, we can finally meet with God and live. And as we prepare to take communion together, let me ask you, have you received a copy of Jesus' resume with your name on it? Waiting in your box. The envelope's there. It's got your name written in bright red letters. Can't miss it. Have you received a copy of Jesus' resume for you? Or are you really preparing to meet God with your own? Do you see how much he loves you? Do you see how much you need him?